Sicario, The Day of the Soldado, is the sequel to the Denis Villeneuve and Roger Deakins masterpiece, Sicario. And I gotta say just right off the bat, when I first heard about this movie coming out, I was really skeptical about it. Just because it just seemed like a sequel that nobody really wanted. People really loved Sicario, but it wasn't really a movie that demanded a sequel or really needed a sequel. So when I heard there's gonna be a sequel, I was like, eh. And then when I saw the trailer, it seemed like it was just kind of gonna focus on being this kind of action-packed movie rather than a more substantive movie. So I gotta say my expectations going into this was rather low. But I figure it's got the same writer, Tyler Sheridan. Obviously completely different director. It's not Denis Villeneuve. It's Italian director with the last name Solima, I believe. And different composer, different cinematographer, all that stuff. So I was skeptical, but again, like I said, it had the same writer, so I said, okay, maybe this could have something going for it. And, honestly, it's not that bad of a movie. It's obviously no original Sicario. In my opinion, it's really not nearly as good as the first film. But this film is much different in a lot of different ways. It has a different approach to its story writing and its characters. I think there is plenty of things about this movie to appreciate and like. But at the same time, I feel like there was other things about this film that were just kind of lacking and I feel like could have been either just done without or could have been done better. But first, let me just start with the positives for this film. I think this film does a great job at maintaining engagement from its audience. Even though I do feel that this film felt overly long, there was moments in this movie where I was kind of wanting it to wrap up. But overall, honestly, it does a great job at making sure that the audience is not bored. Both film lovers and casual audiences, I feel like, will be mostly engaged into this film. And on top of that, I feel like this movie really wanted to explore, I guess the writer, Tyler Sheridan, with the sequel, I feel like he really just wanted to have a more narrative-based film. The narrative in this film is honestly much more complex than the narrative in Sicario. Sicario has a pretty simple narrative. This one really, I feel like, truly wants to explore government corruption, political corruption, and just, impoverished life and cartel life. And really, also on top of that, it also encompasses how kids can be hugely affected by these things. And not just children. This film has, kids from, whether it's a baby that just gets screwed over in the line of fire, whether it's kind of like a young teen daughter of a cartel gang member who is being used for leverage and who actually gets kidnapped and then being used for leverage. This film also follows an older teenager character who gets caught up in kind of the pressures of the environment, kind of forces him to be a part of this new cartel life. And I feel like the film does a pretty good job at conveying a message without being too preachy. And that was a huge relief to me, because the way this film was advertised and the kind of the logo on it, as you can see, has like a Mexican flag on one side, a USA flag on the other. I was worried that this film might try to send a message but be way too overly preachy about it. And it's not really like that. It really isn't. I think it actually does a great job at being subtle for the most part. Sure, there's a few lines of dialogue here that hints at something, but for me, these lines of dialogue wasn't the writer saying his point of view. It's really he has characters that believe certain things and they're saying their point of view. And some of these messages clash, and some people believe in different things. And I felt like, again, I have to say that it did a good job at conveying a message that I feel like wasn't too preachy or one-sided. And like I said earlier, I was pretty skeptical going into this because for me, the trailer seemed like it was trying to advertise this very action-heavy blockbuster type movie. And there really isn't that much action in this movie. Technically there is action, but the action sequences don't really feel like action sequences. They just feel like really intense and violent plot events that are there for a reason. And that was also kind of refreshing as well. I don't feel like the violence in this movie was gratuitous. I heard a lot about how this film is super, super gritty and grim. And it is, but honestly, it's more gritty and grim within its tone. Sure, there is violence in this movie, especially the way it starts, which, by the way, I have a criticism about kind of the way it starts, but I'll get onto that in a second. I really felt that the violence and the action in this movie was fitting. Nothing felt like it was forced. Nothing felt like it was trying to do too much. It all seemed like it had a purpose, and it flowed pretty naturally as well. The performances by the two returning cast members, Josh Brolin and Benicio del Toro, are out of this world. Especially Benicio del Toro, I thought he did a phenomenal job returning with this complex character who is obviously not a good guy. He has, you can argue that he has good intentions, but anybody who's seen the first one knows that he's just done some pretty messed up stuff, including some forced fellatio action. And even though I say that his character is complex in this movie, it's not really complex based on what goes on in this movie. You kind of just have to see the first one in order to really grasp the complexity of Benicio del Toro's character, because in this movie, it's a little bit more one-dimensional than it is in the original Sicario. But besides the performances, I thought there was actually some really intense and extremely engaging moments in this film. There's parts where, sure, it slows down and you're just kind of wait for shit to happen, but I gotta say, there was 2 or 3 moments in this film where it was really intense and I was wondering what was gonna happen, and most of the time when I was trying to predict what was gonna happen, it didn't happen. So on top of it being really intense, it's not the most predictable film either. There's some things about this film that are kind of predictable, but for the most part, when it has those moments of intensity, you don't really see the conclusion coming. You just kind of have to sit and wait to find out what's going to happen. And again, that was also a pretty impressive aspect of this film. All right, so I think that's all of the nice things that I have to really say about the movie. Let me just get started with the criticisms. Like I hinted at earlier with the beginning, with the introduction of this film. Something about it, like, sure, it was gritty because I've heard a lot of other critics say, like, oh man, the beginning introduction of this movie was my jaw was dropped. But I didn't really feel that way. I mean, sure, something pretty shocking occurs in the beginning of this film, but there was a way that it was directed that just felt a little silly and kind of unrealistic. There's something that the director or the writer, I don't know if this was the writer's idea or the director's idea, but there's something that a character does in a supermarket in the beginning that just didn't feel real. It felt like it was trying to reach for emotion, and it was trying to reach for that just shocking feel, and it didn't feel all that real to me. And another criticism overall is obviously the aesthetic value to this movie isn't as superb as a previous, but I'm not gonna hold that against it too much, because of course the previous one is from one of the best contemporary visionary directors, Denis Villeneuve, and then also accompanied by honestly probably the best cinematographer, Roger Deakins, and you're just not going to be able to match up with that. Plus the composer was Johan Johansson, so you know that movie had every aesthetic cornerstone in place, and I'm not going to fault this movie for not meeting. I'm not going to really blame this film too much for not meeting those expectations from the original Sicario. But I will have to say, again, I still have to criticize it somewhat. The score is very similar. I don't even know if it's the same score, but you have that kind of just like daunting horn sound that you kind of hear in Villeneuve films often, just that whoa. And it works in this movie, but it just works so much better in the original, because in the original it had a lot of slow building shots as that horn sound is going. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the cinematography doesn't match the score as well as it did in the first one. It just doesn't. The score is still there and it's still effective. It doesn't miss, but it's just not as effective. And it probably could have been more effective if it was directed differently. And also, like I said in my pros for this movie, is that this film's plot is pretty complex compared to the first. And some of that works for it, and some of it doesn't, in my opinion. I feel like it could have if it was, again, either written a little bit better or directed better. For instance, I'm not going to really spoil anything here, but like I said earlier, it follows a older teenage boy who is kind of and pressured by the environment to join gang life. But I felt like that could have been a lot more insightful and a lot more substantive. And what I'm getting at is that this film doesn't have much character depth to it, besides Benicio del Toro. But I feel like most of the character depth you get for Benicio del Toro is in the previous movie. So I don't really count the film too much for giving him depth, because it doesn't. So this film, in my opinion, really lacks a lot of character depth. Like I was saying, it follows this older teenage boy, and he doesn't have much to it besides that he gets pressured into this, and that's it. He doesn't really talk very much in this movie. He doesn't even really convey a lot of facial emotions at all. Most of the movie, he's just like this. And I guess I could see why they were trying to go for that angle, but at the same time, it just felt like it was just lacking. You don't really get to know him at all throughout this movie. And on top of that, this movie kind of ends. Some people have been praising the ending to this movie. I'm not one of those people. I was really not a fan of the way this movie ended. It felt cheap. It felt like it was just trying to set up for another movie, which it totally did. Who knows? All I know is that in this movie, they didn't give me a lot to take away from his character, or really anything to grab onto when it comes to his character. And I wish it did. Overall, though, it's not a bad movie. It's not. I have my criticisms with it, obviously, but I did enjoy watching it. I'm not mad that I watched it. I don't think this does any harm to the Sicario movie name. I think it's fine. It accompanies it in a decent way, in a different way, but in a decent way as well. So I'm going to give Sicario Day of the Soldado a 6.5 out of 10. Yeah, it's not the highest score ever, but it's fresh, technically. Alright guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video and hearing what I had to say about Sicario Day of the Soldado. If you've seen it already, please comment below, let me know your thoughts on it. And if you really like what I had to say, please give this video a thumbs up and share it amongst your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the Misfit Pawn channel to be updated on more film-related content.